Hey everybody, doing something a little different today. Just decided to record a vlog and look back at some of the books I read this year and give out some recommendations. I know I am way too late to give recommendations for potential Christmas gifts, but maybe you received some books for Christmas that you don't want and you're planning on returning them for store credit. Well, if you do that and you have some store credit, maybe you can use that to buy some of the books I'm going to talk about today. So who knows? Maybe you'll find something you like. I've talked about a couple of these books in my podcasts earlier throughout the year, but just thought I would go through some of the books I read this year and give out some recommendations to any classic rock fans who might be putting together their own reading list for 2021. So let's get started. The first book I read this year was actually what inspired my whole interview series on the podcast. The first book I read I got for Christmas last year was Rock Monster, My Life with Joe Walsh. This is by Kristen Casey. She was a guest on the show. She was the debut guest of Play That Rock and Roll. Great interview. It was great to meet her. When I got this book for Christmas, I asked for it because I knew I wanted one of my first podcast episodes to be about Joe Walsh, and I wanted to do some research on Joe, and this is really the only book that's out there specifically about him. There are some other Eagles biographies that have been written, but there's not many, and they tend to focus on Glenn Frey and Don Henley, and Joe isn't really the focus, particularly when it comes to the years that Kristen was with Joe. Kristen dated Joe in the late 80s, and these were the years that his drug and alcohol addictions were getting out of control, and his career was suffering because of it. So when it comes to biographies or articles or anything that's written about Joe now, these years are largely skipped over. When I spoke to Kristen about the book, she said it was really two books. It was one part a classic rock story of Joe's life and career during those years, but the other part was about the very nature of drug and alcohol addiction itself and what it can do to a person. Joe and Kristen were addicted to drugs and alcohol together. Joe got himself cleaned up and sober before Kristen did, and when you get to the part of the book when they split and Kristen's life goes off the rails, it's a very different story from what you thought you might have started reading. But that's a positive, because what happens in the later end of the book, when Kristen is going through her own struggles with drugs and alcohol, that's the part of the story that is truly gripping and nerve-wracking. It's incredible what she survived. And I think that's the whole point of a book, is to tell a good story. And to tell a story that gives hope in the end, because she is a survivor. She went through hell, but she made it out. And she takes you through that awful years-long journey and gives really good insight into what the world of a drug addict is, and what that can do to a person, and what that person then has to do to get out of that life, and how close to not getting out of it she came. So I really recommend it. I recommend it for the rock and roll fans who like Joe Walsh and the Eagles and want to learn about Joe's life and career during this stretch. It really does feel like you're sitting around with a friend and she's just telling you some of these great stories, and by the time it gets to the really heavy stuff, well, you're interested, because all of the stuff before it was really engaging and fun. It doesn't stop being engaging. It goes into the heavy topic, and it's captivating, and you want to see how she makes it through in the end. So I really enjoyed that book. It was a real treat to speak to her about it earlier this year. If you're interested, please check out my interview with it's a two-parter with Kristen. She tells a lot of the stories from the book, and she's a lot of fun. So check out her website, get the book. I believe she still has signed copies available, so if you're interested in that, check it out. The second book I read this year was Bon: The Last Highway by Jesse Fink. And, as it turns out, what I'm reading right now is the book he put out before that, The Youngs, the brothers who built AC/DC. So, Jesse Fink has these two great AC/DC books. I'm really enjoying The Youngs right now. I haven't finished it, but my God, Bon, look at how thick this is. This is one of the best rock and roll books I've ever come across. The research that Jesse did is truly impressive. And if you're an AC/DC fan or if you're interested in Bon Scott, this is an absolute must read. Jesse did unbelievable research and insane globetrotting to track down every major person in Bon's life, and he spoke to so many of them who have now since passed away. He got the last words on Bon Scott from so many people that were Bon's closest friends, to tell the story of who this guy was and also what actually happened to him when he passed away. There's sort of a narrative about him just drinking himself to death in the backseat of a car. Jesse does some really impressive detective work and discovers that it's probably not that simple. And if you want to know about Bon's life and his tragic passing, I don't think anybody could put together a better account of how it went down. I have a bookshelf full of rock and roll biographies, and I have never come across a book that does such impressive research on a specific subject like Jesse did for Bon Scott. It's an absolute masterpiece, and it stands head and shoulders above the mountain of other AC/DC biographies that are out there. Like I said, it's one of the most impressive things I've ever read, and if you're looking for good rock and roll journalism, it's tough to beat this one. Very well researched. I'm excited to read more from Jesse in the future. I know that he takes his work very seriously, and that makes for a great product. So, highly recommended. Now, the next book I read wasn't so much a research project. This one was just... I got this one, again, last year for Christmas from... I actually got it twice. I got it from my dad and my brother, so I have two copies of this. This is Twilight of the Gods, A Journey to the End of Classic Rock. This was written by Steven Hyden, who hosts the Rivals podcast, which is a great music podcast, by the way. Highly recommended. This book, it's hard to describe what this book is. It's sort of like the state of affairs of classic rock in the late 2010s. It tells you the condensed story of some of our favorite bands. It explains why we as classic rock fans like these artists, and it also references so many of the concert movies, documentaries, and other rock and roll books that we as fans have come across over the years. And for me, what I found this book to be was almost sort of a coping mechanism for classic rock fans, because the unfortunate reality of classic rock in 2020 is that many of our classic rock heroes have passed away, and many more have retired from touring, and the glory days for the whole genre is pretty far behind us now. So where does that leave us? Well, this book answers that. It's about the very nature of classic rock fandom itself, and it's written by a guy who I identify a lot with because he, like me, is from Wisconsin, sort of grew up after the glory days of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and has read all of the same books that I have, and I just reading through these pages, it was awesome to read someone who's seen some of the exact same concerts I've seen. I enjoyed that one quite a bit too. So we're going to pivot a little bit away from rock and roll. I have some other books that I read that rock fans might appreciate. When I interviewed Austin Trunick, I mentioned to him that I wanted to have him on the show because I think there has to be some overlap between fans of AC/DC and fans of the Cannon films, Chuck Norris, Charles Bronson. And we kind of got a big laugh out of that. And I can't be the only guy who likes classic rock and also the movies of Charles Bronson, particularly the Death Wish series. I talked to Austin quite a bit about the Death Wish series, and we have both read this book by Paul Talbot. I'm sure you read Paul Talbot's books.
If you're interested in Death Wish or any of the Bronson canon movies, or any Bronson movie, period, you need to seek out those books. Paul Talbot's books, any canon fan needs to grab both of those.
Paul Talbot has become sort of the world's authority on the life and career of actor Charles Bronson, and this was his first book about Charles Bronson, called Bronson's Loose, The Making of the Death Wish Films. It's not a particularly long book, but it's about all 5 Death Wish movies, covers how they came to be. You know, it interviews a number of principal characters from the Death Wish story, like director Michael Winner, some of Bronson's co-stars, and also the author of the original Death Wish book. So, if you like Charles Bronson, and you like the Death Wish movies, well, this is a no-brainer. It's a pretty short read, real enjoyable. I love Charles Bronson. I like that era of movies. I like 80s action movies. The Death Wish movies are among my favorites. So, this was a lot of fun for me. And Paul Talbot's got a second book, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that was just sort of a precursor to what I have to say is my favorite book of the year. And like I said to him when he came on the show, my favorite book of almost any year. This is the Cannon Film Guide, Volume 1, years 1980 to 1984, by Austin Trunick. Austin was a guest on my podcast earlier this year, which was a real treat. It was really great to talk to him about some of these fantastic movies that were put out in the early days of the Cannon Film Company, which was owned and operated by Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. Cannon Films is a pretty niche subject, so I realize that this book isn't for everybody, and I think it's because I'm just such a fan of that film production company and that style of movie making that these two books, Bronson's Loose and the Cannon Film Guide, that I got my 80s action movie fix this year definitely with those. The important thing to remember about the Cannon Film Guide is that it is not like a narrative. It's not one story. It's a collection of chapters that discusses each and every movie Cannon produced in the early 80s. So it's a series of stories because it tells you about how they produced each and every movie they made in those early years. And this is the first of 3 volumes, by the way. I really enjoyed that book. I'm so excited for Cannon Film Guide Volume 2, which is due out in fall 2021. Hopefully, I'll get Austin to come on the show to talk about that one when it's done. Speaking of people I interviewed, another book I read this year was In Awe, Beatles, Baseball, and Bourbon, Appreciating Spectacular and Simple Stuff by Steve Palick. Steve Palick is a local radio host here in Milwaukee, legendary radio host, has hosted his Sunday morning show, Rock and Roll Roots, for over 30 years now. Great show, and for people who live in the Milwaukee area, I really enjoyed this book. It's a great story about what it's like being on the radio. It's also a series of fantastic anecdotes about just living in Milwaukee and experiencing all the great stuff my hometown has to offer. This is just a fun book for anybody that knows this area, because it's just great story after great story of people, places, and things that we as Milwaukeeans and Wisconsinites are very familiar with. So it's a very accessible book. Steve's got a great writing style. If you're a fan of Steve's show, Rock and Roll Roots, and all the interviews he's conducted over the years, there's a lot of interview snippets in here that are really good. Or if you just live in Milwaukee or really anywhere in Wisconsin, there's going to be some good stuff here for you. I enjoyed talking to Steve about this book on my podcast quite a bit. I love all these stories he has, and I really recommend it to anybody who lives in the area and is familiar with his show. I think he did a really good job with it. So earlier this year, I did a podcast about Eddie Money. And when I was putting this podcast together and doing the research for it, I couldn't believe it. But there was only one book published about Eddie, and it was put out just last year. This is Hold On, the story of our friend Eddie Money by Dresden Engel. Dresden knew Eddie only in the last couple years of his life because she was working with him on a musical about his life and career. And unfortunately, Eddie passed away before that musical was ever able to truly go on the road. So she didn't really know him for that long. And I saw an interview in which she talked about writing this book, and she said she couldn't believe that there wasn't ever a book about Eddie, because Eddie is a really interesting character and he's had a great career. There should be a book about him. So I appreciate what she did with this. It's not a very long book, but she did some serious research on everything she could find about Eddie online and her own anecdotes of just knowing him in his last years, and put together this nice little compilation. It's not the deepest book I've ever read. Dresden isn't a rock journalist. She's obviously, she says right in the title, she's a friend of Eddie's, so this is a celebration of his life and career, not really a research project. But she did a really good job just kind of putting together so many great stories and facts about him that for people who want to be introduced to Eddie Money, this is a good place to start. For newcomers to Eddie's music, or for someone who just wants to remember Eddie's career, this is a good collection. And there's some nice pictures in here. Everything's in color, you know. It's not bad. The important thing to remember about this one is that this is absolutely from a fan's perspective and a friend's perspective. So if you're looking for that sort of story, that sort of collection, yeah, if you like Eddie Money, this is, I'd say there's some good stuff here. Okay, now we're going to pivot off of biographies altogether, and we're going to move on to a little bit of fiction I read this year. But don't worry, it's only 2. I'm not a big fiction reader. I usually read biographies and nonfiction, so I dipped my toe back into it, and I started by reading Stephen King's The Running Man. Yes! I know this is sort of an out-of-left-field pick, but I watched The Running Man earlier this year, remembered how much I loved that movie, and decided, you know what? I want to read the book that it was based on in. Holy shit, the book is so much different from the movie, but it's such a great way. It's, you know, the movie itself is sort of funny. It's definitely a, you know, blockbuster style movie. It's, you know, meant to, you know, have a broad appeal. This book is pretty intense. You know, it should come as no surprise. You know, it's Stephen King that wrote it, but it's very dark. There's some language in this book that would absolutely not be okay if it were published in 2020. So you have to, you know, keep in mind that this was published in the early 80s, so it's not politically correct. But I found the story to be really fun, and King's writing style was really enjoyable for me. If you can believe it, I've never read a Stephen King book before. This was the first one, and yeah, I liked it. You know, Stephen King's got enough praise over the years that I don't really need to add to it. But if you're looking for a nice, light, you know, casual read from Stephen King that isn't some 12,000-page anthology project, you know, check out this one. If you like the movie, this is pretty good. Just, you know, fair warning, there's some pretty intense language and some... The ending is also clearly written in the 80s. That one was a lot of fun. But that just sort of warmed me up for the next project that I read. This is the last book I will recommend today. This is Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis. Lindsay Ellis is a YouTuber, and she is probably the best YouTuber. I have been a fan of hers since she started, and every video she puts out beats the one before it, and I am constantly impressed of what great quality content she releases on her channel. It goes back to what I was talking about with Jesse Fink. She's someone who does the research and has the sources and does the real work to discuss the media she's covering. And she's put out a whole bunch of videos on subjects that I could not care less about, but I've watched them anyway and stayed really engaged and entertained all the way through because of how she presents it. And she's really, which is, she's very funny, she's very engaging, very personable. So I really recommend her YouTube channel. And because I'm such a fan of hers, I decided I wanted to read her first book, which she released this year. This is sort of an alien invasion science fiction story. And like I said, I don't read a lot of fiction, and I know a lot of the movies that inspired her when she was writing this book, I'm not really a big fan of. And when it comes to sci-fi, yeah, I like some of it, but I'm not really a diehard for that genre. So if it was written by anybody else, I probably would have skipped it. But I was curious to see what she would do with it, and, man, it was really good. I really enjoyed it. Very accessible, very fun to read. I think she did a great job with it, and she's got the sequel to it coming out next year, and I think this is supposed to be the first of 5 books, but I'll probably read all 5 as long as they keep up the level of quality found in this one. Like I said, really engaging, very accessible, for someone who doesn't read really any sci-fi. This was a great kind of starting point for me, and I'm curious to see what she has coming next. So, well done, Lindsay. Well done, everybody I talked about here. I really enjoyed every one of these books. Hopefully I've mentioned something here that will spark your interest, and you'll seek it out. If you do, please come back to this video and post in the comment which one you read and how you liked it. I'd love to hear any feedback on some of these if you've checked them out as well. So there you go. 10 books that you can put on your reading list in 2021. I'm sure there's at least one I've mentioned that strikes your fancy. So that's what I read in 2020. Now let's take a quick look at some of the books I've earmarked for reading in 2021. If you've read all of these, or if none of these interested you, maybe you'll like some of these I'm about to mention, and hey, we can read them at the same time. You can tell me what you think. I'm going to go through these quickly because I haven't read these. These are just the ones that I have on hand that I intend to read in 2021. I might not get to them, but I do hope to. First one, Never Look at the Empty Seats by Charlie Daniels. Charlie Daniels died earlier this year, and although I wasn't a fan of the politics he turned his social media account into, I did listen to a lot of his music this year, and there's a lot of it I like. I do like that outlaw country sound, and even though he was sort of a controversial figure even before he got to be Mr. Political Commentator on Twitter, I do have an appreciation for the music he produced in his heyday. I've read a couple of pages from it. Seems like a pretty accessible read, a pretty light read. I enjoy his music enough that I'm curious to know some of the stories behind some of the songs. And, look, he's got Dolly Parton here writing a blurb on the back. So, look, this guy was for real. He was a serious player in that classic country scene. Am I going to do a podcast about him? No, probably not. You know why? Because there's also a Sean Hannity blurb on the back of the book. So I do want to celebrate the guy's music, but we'll see what happens when I read it. Now here's a book I'd love to do a podcast about. I'm With the Band, Confessions of a Groupie by Pamela Des Barres. I talked about this book briefly when Kristen Casey came on the show. This was definitely an inspiration to Kristen.
When I first read Pamela's I'm With the Band, it's funny to me now that I actually have a blurb on my book. I mean, if you'd have told me then that I was actually going to write a book, and that the amazing Miss Pamela was going to write a blurb, I would have said, okay, well then I can die happy. Now I have no worries in life.
Pamela has become this legendary queen of the groupies figure in classic rock. She has her own podcast that I've listened to a couple episodes of. That's a very good podcast she does. And she's got a whole series of books. So I'm hoping to read this one and also the follow-up biography she wrote called Take Another Little Piece of My Heart. I'm hoping to read both of those back to back, and maybe I'll do a podcast about her life and experiences, because I know this book is just full of great stories. She was a very controversial figure when this book came out, but now appropriately, she is heralded as sort of a trailblazer and an icon in her own right, and I hope to celebrate that and learn more about her this year. So on the heels of I'm with the Band, I have another book here that this one was just put out last year. This is called Unrated: Revelations of a Rock and Roll Centerfold by Carrie Stevens. Carrie Stevens was the girlfriend of Eric Carr from Kiss. Eric tragically died, and Carrie was with him until the end. So much in the tradition of I'm with the Band, this is a story about a woman who found her way into the world of rock and roll and kind of made that world her own and had her own great story. I'm pretty sure this book is going to have all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll that a cover like this would promise. So we'll see where it goes with this one. Hopefully I can do something on the show with that book and with I'm with the Band, and there's some other ones that are written by the ladies who were in the lives of some of our favorite classic rock artists, and I think their stories and perspectives are really interesting. And in my experience so far, books like these are a little more candid about the backstage world of rock and roll. So it'll be interesting to read her perspective, and we'll see what happens there. Okay, keeping it with the ladies. Another book I want to read this year, Grace Notes by Katey Sagal. Katey Sagal is an actor that I've been a fan with since I was a kid. She was Peg on Married with Children. She was the voice of Leela on Futurama. And in recent years, she was Gemma on Sons of Anarchy. I was a fan of all three shows, especially Married with Children growing up. It was so funny that when I had Kristen Casey on my podcast, she talked about how Joe Walsh had a crush on Katey Sagal during her years on Married with Children. So it was kind of funny just to hear about that. You might not realize this, but Katey started her career in music. She was in a couple of different groups, and she sang as a backup singer with some pretty big-name artists, including Etta James and Bob Dylan. And she has a couple of albums of her own. So I am going to seek out the music she released over the years. I'm going to read this book, and I'm pretty sure I'm definitely going to do a podcast episode dedicated to her music career, because I think she is totally underrated when it comes to being a musical artist. I've seen her in concert. She's got a great voice, got a great stage presence, and I'm really interested to see what she says in this book. I think this is going to be a really interesting project to do. I've been wanting to read her book for a number of years now, so I finally got it, and you'll hear more from me about Katey later in 2021. Okay, what else do we got here? This is the one I'm not sure if I'm going to get to this year, but I think I'm going to have to, because I believe these guys will be going out on the road at some point in late 2021. The Dirt. Confessions of the World's Most Notorious Rock Band, Motley Crue. Okay. So this is the book that the Netflix movie was based on. It's, written with contributions from all four guys. This is a pretty thick book. This is supposed to be the whole story. I've had this book for a couple of years now. I have put off reading it again and again and again, but, since they announced late last year, late 2019, that they were going to reunite and get out on the road, well, COVID blew that up, and it remains to be seen, but most likely they're going to be going back on the road as Motley Crue, probably at some point 2021, maybe 2022, but in any case, since they're going to be back in the news and back on stage, I figure this will be as good of a time as any for me to finally get around to their book, and then also watch the Netflix movie. So if I do both of those, I will definitely have some sort of either a YouTube video or a podcast about it. I don't like any of the guys in Motley Crue, but god damn it, I like their music quite a bit, so what are you gonna do? Okay, and then just sort of a book that follows up with a book I just mentioned a little while ago. This is Bronson's Loose Again, also by Paul Talbot. This is On Set with Charles Bronson. This is sort of an extension of his Death Wish movies book. This is about all of Charles Bronson's movies, so this is a much more serious read than the one I read this year. I just like Paul's writing style. I'm a big Charles Bronson fan, so while I wait for Canon Film Guide Volume 2, this will have to hold me over. A couple of other books off the top of my head that I plan to read this year that I don't have on hand. I plan to get a hold of Van Halen Rising by Greg Renoff. Greg Renoff is like the ultimate Van Halen fan, and his Van Halen Rising seems to be the gold standard of Van Halen biographies. I have two others on my bookshelf, so my plan is to get Van Halen Rising and then read that, followed quickly by the other two that I have, and sort of sort out which one I like the most. The other thing is Greg also wrote a book about Ted Templeton, who was Van Halen's producer in the early days, and he also worked with Foreigner and some other groups. So I'm guessing I'm going to really like those books. They are highly recommended and reviewed online, so I'm curious to check out those projects. One book I just purchased today, and it hasn't shipped yet, is Magic Carpet Ride, the autobiography of John Kay and Steppenwolf. First things first, we have the same last name, but I am not related to John Kay. Believe me, if I was, I would find some way to be around Steppenwolf, but I am not, unfortunately. I saw Steppenwolf in concert in 2015. I actually had a really good time, and I was supposed to see him in concert this year, but that was one of the shows that had to get canceled because of COVID. So there's definitely going to be a podcast episode about John Kay and Steppenwolf later this year, and his autobiography will be sort of the backbone of that research, so keep an eye out for that. And then the last thing I plan to read at some point next year, although probably not till late in the year, will be Canon Film Guide Volume 2, when Austin puts that out. He said that's supposed to be out sometime in fall 2021. Yeah, I'll probably buy that the week it goes on sale, and hopefully we'll have him back on the show to talk about it. And then finally, going back to fiction for just a little bit, I'm going to dive back into my fandom of Judge Dredd. I know that might catch you a little off guard here, but I am a big Judge Dredd fan, and I have a couple of compendiums of the Judge Dredd comics, so I'm going to read at least one of those. And I also have a couple of paperbacks of Judge Dredd, so I'm going to read at least one of those this year as well. I am a huge fan of Dredd, the movie that came out in 2012. Disappointed that there was never a sequel to that. I thought it was done excellently. I've seen the 95 movie with Stallone, and it's stupid, but there's some decent moments, but by and large it's pretty dumb. But because of how much I liked the movie Dredd from 2012, I got into the Judge Dredd comics, and I started reading them a couple years ago. And I'm not a comic guy at all. I don't read any comics except for Judge Dredd. I really like it. I don't know why. And I was just saying I was sort of a casual sci-fi fan. I don't know if this counts as science fiction, but if it does, okay, then I gotta take back what I said, because I am a huge Judge Dredd fan, and I'm definitely gonna get back into reading those comics and some of the paperbacks this year. So I'll tell you what I think about those at the end of the year next year. Okay, well, I've gone on way longer than I originally planned to, but there's 10 books I read in 2020 that I really recommend, and then 10 or so books I'm planning on reading in 2021. Maybe you'll read some of those along with me. If you've read any of the books I've mentioned today, or if you have any recommendations of your own, please post your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear what you're reading. I would love to hear what your thoughts on some of these books are. Otherwise, that's all I got for today. Everybody out there, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and happy holidays. And thank you for a fantastic first year of Play That Rock and Roll, the podcast, the channel, the content hub. It really means a lot to me that you gave us a listen or you checked us out here in our first year. So we've got a lot of great stuff coming in 2021, but thanks for joining us here in 2020. See you next year.